Hi, listeners. My guest today is a legal strategist and consultant at PwC in London. Howard and I peppered Greg with questions about the UK legal market, how it has changed over the last 20 years, how are UK law firms different than US, how has private and public capital changed the UK legal market, and more. Enjoy. Welcome, Greg, to the Future is Bright podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Greg, please provide just a brief bio of your background. We'd love to hear more about you.
Yeah, so I'm a director here at PwC in the UK. I lead all of our strategy and business transformation work with our law firm clients, which goes from everything kind of in the front office side, so practice improvement, pricing, deals, strategy, all the way through to finance transformation, back office cost reduction. So kind of a kind of full span of front to back office in law firms. And prior to that, I was the strategy director of Magic Circle firm for 7 years, where I did a whole heap of really interesting projects, which I'm sure we're going to talk about over the next period.
And that was Link Ladders, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, how do you know Howard?
Well, I've had the pleasure of knowing Howard for quite a long time now. So I think Howard and I really first touched base around all of the work that he's been doing kind of around lateral DD. Super interesting area, particularly when you start to think about scale of some of the practices that firms are looking at bringing into their own business, and the need to be much more commercial about how you go about doing that. So just a little bit of patter for Howard there, but that's how I know him.
Kind of a quick question to kick this off. Could you provide us just a brief overview of what's going on in the UK legal market right now?
Yeah, so we've literally just published our PwC UK law firm survey, and we launched it on Monday this week, which would have been the 21st of October. That is a review of the top 100 firms. They provide us with a huge amount of their data. I guess the top line is everyone's doing really, really well. Last year's results, firms kind of blew through what they thought they would do. They provide us with a prediction for future years, and they significantly outperformed that. And interestingly, normally it's pretty accurate. So normally they're close to what they put into those predictions. But this year there was kind of big surprise to the upside. So I think it's a good market. The deals market's coming back online a bit more now as well. So that will hopefully drive even more kind of excellence and kind of outturn for our law firm clients. I guess as an overall picture, been really interesting lateral market. And we've seen some of our American friends getting some novelty checks out for some extremely high quality people, a number of whom are my ex-colleagues who've joined Paul Weiss's platform in London. So it's been really interesting, both in this kind of macro side around performance, but also really at the top line around kind of lateral moves.
And Greg, where do you think that growth is happening at firms? Is that organic growth? Is it through the lateral markets? Like, what do you see? Because you have a ringside seat into the markets with the clients that you're working with across, obviously, the prestige of the environment. What's happening?
So let's do a law firm economics answer, which is there's a bit of a split between rate growth and through chargeable hours growth. And I think probably UK market has benefited from our American friends being here, growing, driving kind of realised rates up and kind of headline rates up, which has helped lots of UK firms for sure. I think we've kind of been in this interesting zone between oscillating a little bit contentious and a little bit transactional, and neither has been very dominant, i.e. there's a number of UK firms that have a much stronger kind of litigation, disputes, arbitration kind of bent, and that's meant they've done well, and actually the kind of corporate finance focused firms have also done well, even though probably deals market's been not as busy as people would have wanted it to be. But actually, just rate growth's been so good over this last period. And I think I'm sure that's been true in the US too, right? The kind of rates been so strong, realised rates been brilliant. It's meant firms' top line and profitability's grown alongside it.
Yeah, people tell me that sometimes the rate growth for law firms are telling me sometimes it's like 40% of their growth has come through the rates. the rate increases. So that's phenomenal.
It's an opportune number, Howard, because when we published our survey on Monday, the Financial Times, we gave them a little exclusive, and out of that came a headline which is realised rates have increased for top 10 firms by 40% since 2019. And as you may know, in the FT comment section, if you've ever gone in there and read lots of comments, there's huge volume of comments around, but there's been lots of inflation. Of course, which is true. But actually, from an economics perspective within law firms' performance, probably for some firms, I suspect that's covered up chargeable hours, not sins, but covered up a kind of gap in chargeable hours. But actually, I think our perspective between the last few financial years is, I think we thought chargeable hours was going to top out post sort of that near to COVID 22-23 period, where you could see a little bit of a fall off. And I just thought, well, actually, maybe that's a bit of a trend as we go into the next couple of years, and actually been more sticky than I think people expected to be alongside rates, which has then really driven that kind of top line growth.
So what does that do for the market if you think that there's no real end in sight for that upward trajectory of rate growth? What does that do for the other people at the other end of the spectrum who are maybe not in an elite position in the marketplace, and you're getting rate pressures, and you're also getting kind of the newly qualified rates are also climbing. You're getting huge compression in the marketplace. What's going on?
So maybe two things, right? My old managing partner, Gideon Moore, if he's watching this, great guy. He always used to say you're one day close to a recession. And one of the projects that I always encourage clients to do, and I did in my old world, was how can you situate your exec or board in a kind of 10% off the top line reduction, whether hours or price or some combination of the two, right? Situate yourself in that issue and think, what do we do about cash? What do we do with our clients? What work do we want to hold on to that we're willing to go for a downward cycle, even if it's painful? So there's a ton of things I think which should always be in firms' mind when you've been on an up and up and up and up and up, thinking quite carefully about that kind of scenario-based consideration is really important. That's just one thing to your first point. I think on the second bit, like the UK mid-market is in a really interesting position. And there are a number of firms who've publicly said we want to double the size of our firm, double income. And of course, a big part of that is how do you deal with the scale of capital investment that's required, whether that's technology, real estate, and also pay. And we've seen, right, you will have seen NQ pay in the UK, where some of the UK headquartered firms, which maybe you could argue are becoming much more US, Freshfields, are driving a wedge in that space where NQ pay was probably a lot tighter between, say, your DLAs of the world and Freshfields of the world. But actually there's gaps beginning to increasingly open up, and probably the market's beginning to be a bit more stratified in terms of that. Which then, well, you will know this, and then I'll stop talking. You can ask me some more questions, where there's a deep compression on pay in the kind of junior, mid, senior associate world, particularly for the regional and London-based firms, where that pressure on NQ pay pushes hard up into very quickly your kind of junior, senior associate pay, right? So the difference between what an NQ's paid versus an extremely experienced MA isn't that big. It should be, right, from an experience capability perspective, but that's got closer over time. I don't know whether firms have made big uplifts in those zones, right? But seems like quite a structural problem.
So do you see kind of a greater stratification of the marketplace, or are you kind of bullish on the process going forward with some of these firms?
Always bullish on UK PLC, Howard. I think it's interesting. So I did a presentation with some people in the sector about US firms in London, their strength and growth over the last sort of decade. And the strength of some of the UK firms, even over that period, whether it's just UK firms, regional firms, single city firms, or actually international firms, they've still done so well. And if you think there was I don't know, we had the Great Resignation, all of that. But like if you think about for a lot of firms between 2012 and say 2019, there was a sort of great stagnation, right? People kind of found it hard to grow, headcount relatively flat. How do we massage partner equity? All of those things. And now they've gone through this big uptick in growth. Probably not that dissimilar to the run into the GFC in 2008, right? Which is to that point earlier about kind of scenario planning. So it's hard. I'm always bullish on this stuff. I just think all my clients just talk about growth, practice, sector, geography, product. That's what they're focused on, right? How do we do more, get greater capability, reach into the next tier up of quality of partner onto our platform? So, yeah.
So, Greg, I'd love to hear the cheeky differences between US and UK law firms. Shed some light for our listeners.
There is quite a different economics piece, or at least this is how I perceive it. So you tell me if I'm on the money here, where the UK model is, probably a bit more leveraged, not massive leverage, but like 5 to 6 to 1 type number, and rates will be softer than the US, but still good, and utilization will be softer but still good, right? So the combination of you can have more of a leveraged model means you can still make really good money. I think the difference in the US, right, is, and you tell me if this is fair, lower leverage and actually more a sense of we work for a partner rather than we're in groups that we might work for different partners on different jobs. Much higher chargeability, much higher chargeability at the partner level and at the lawyer level, and really strong rates. So I think that it does create a different kind of culture, right? That difference in utilization and leverage model, which you can see in RPL stats, the difference between the UK and US law firms, really strong, right? So more productive on that basis. I guess probably some differences of ways of working as well around office. This is getting into a niche area, right? But coming into the office, how they work, how UK lawyers and US lawyers work in the office. I think there probably are some differences, but not major. I actually think there's a lot more similarities than differences. That's just a cultural thing, right? Though there's a lot more similarities between British people and Americans than we might otherwise like to tell each other. So I do think there's a fundamental economics difference, which misunderstood can, I think, drive some quite weird cultural misunderstandings of just ways of working, clients, and how to face into clients and the role that partners play in that versus scale of leveraged model. That creates a bit of a different dynamic, I think. You're going to get a load of lawyers, partners listening to this who I used to work with being oh, I can't believe you'd say that.
Yeah, and as the dual nationality person on this call, my
all right, Howard.
No, I think it's the hours, it's the yearly hour figure, which is the big difference, because if you're somewhere between 1,600 and 1,700, on average at some of the magic circle firms, and historically, compared to something like Paul Weiss and the elite firms at 22, even 2,400 hours. You ramp that up times the number of associates and partners, it's a whopping figure. I mean, it's a stark difference between the two. And so you think about the leanness also of the back office functions within some of the US firms compared to the UK firms, and you get to a difference in profitability.
I guess probably two kind of responses to that. One of which is And I don't know actually how this has played out in the US, but there's been in the UK in the last, probably in particular, last 12 months, there have been a number of quite bad well-being incidents that have happened, which have caused firms to really think about how do you connect utilization into understanding of what people are doing. This can be quite hidden, to your point, big hours, etc. I think, though, right, that the hours piece is important. I always think there's a bit of a misnomer about the back office, so I'm going to stick up for my ex-business services colleagues and say, I think on a per-person basis, the US is way more expensive for functional roles than they are in the UK. There will be roles in the UK in the finance space that will be 40,000 GBP. Whereas in the US, you would not get anywhere near that sort of number for a kind of mid-level or lower level finance person. It'd be a lot more. And often when people who've worked for me have gone to the US to then think about coming back to the UK, the sort of pay level would require them to be global COO of like a top 15 firm, just to be clear. So I agree with you that there are fewer but much higher paid individuals, I think. It's probably... which I think probably goes to the point of like ex-partner level expectations of the ability to be both strategic, but then to roll your sleeves up, which I do think is a bit of a difference between not just the type of person and pay point, but also kind of the expectation, I think, which is you've got to be able to get in the trenches with partners, as well as be able to operate in the thoughtful strategic go-to-market type piece too.
Greg, I have a question. So here in the United States, we're experiencing massive consolidation. So lots of mergers, lots of lateral movement. What used to be the AmLaw 200 10 years ago is just a completely different group of law firms, almost entirely. I mean, there's a similar top group of firms at the top, but a lot of new faces, a lot of new firms over 10 years, and all the economics are just going through the roof. Is this happening in the UK? I mean, I know you guys have had a lot of different changes, and Brexit being one of them, but like, what's taking place with the UK legal market? Because I would say that that's a big market. It's an important one.
Yeah, so probably a couple of things to say. I just did a piece of work around what I call the sort of kind of near bias, and particularly when it comes to deals in the UK. So I went back 20 years, 2004, and then looked at the UK 100 then, kindly provided to me by Legal Business in the UK, and then looked at, okay, so what does it look like now? And actually, when you, not dissimilar to you, I had this like vaguely helpful page that had the list of the 100 in 2004, and then there's a red line through which firms don't exist anymore because they've combined into something else. And actually, there's like 8 firms that haven't done large scale deals, or in some sort of domestic combination or series of combinations, because actually firms did one deal and then did several others. So I think there's an element of, there were a lot of deals between in that sort of 2010 to 2012 period, particularly thinking about combining Australia and Canada and various other components. Obviously, Womble, Bond Dickinson have done a series of deals into the US and then more in the US. And of course, they have a different structure, split structure, Eversheds. So there have been a lot of deals. In the mid-sized space, there's, I think, a lot of firms that would benefit from doing that. The challenge is, right, that everyone's sort of looking at each other and seeing who blinks. And you guys will know that there's a ton of reasons not to do something as opposed to, and some of them are quite specific, e.g., I'm a managing partner in year 1 of my first term. If I do a deal, will I have a job at the end of it? So there's a bunch of very personal as well as firm level components to that. Strong view that when you think about what's coming in terms of technology investment, lawyer salaries, the need to kind of be more international and cope with more complex regulatory environments to operate US, Europe, UK. I just see a world in which you need more scale. And I always say this, like, oh, it's growth for growth's sake. And actually, I used to be like, oh, you definitely don't want to do that. There's no logic in it whatsoever. And actually, there's a little bit of logic. I've come off the pot of 100% absolutely not to 98%. So I could see like there's a ton of UK-based firms that would benefit from a transaction, whether that's US-UK transaction or actually UK-UK. In the smaller UK firms, so say 51 to 100, so that's from an income perspective, say 100, 120 million down to say 50 million. I think there's ripe for tons of deal activity there, loads. But I think there's a classic of dominoes to fall, and a bit of movement will mean managing partners start to think, well, actually, maybe I do need to do something. And it's as much about good relationships between MPs to begin with, or chairs, as where that conversation begins, right? So I personally think there'll be lots.
Yeah. So, Greg, as a follow-up to kind of Chris's question about the structure of the UK firms, because of the ABS, which is, sort of kind of spurred innovation and kind of doing things in a different way, has that had a material effect on the UK market going forward?
So I think we've probably got much more interesting models as a result of that than you guys do. Soz, probably the only thing we're better at here. On the one hand, you've got Knights PLC, who David Beach, the CEO's good connection of mine. They're just so interesting, right? They're in a place of doing really interesting things in a different way to everyone else because they're listed. It creates a different kind of accountability of execution, which when you are kind of core commercial firm LLP structure with your board, if you don't tell anyone anything outside of the board, so the partners hold you to account, are you really accountable for much change? It's quite, I'm sure, anyone who's listening to this will think, well, actually, yeah, we do talk about a lot of stuff at the board, and does anything really get done? There'll be loads of firms like that. So I do think either listed nature is interesting, and then, of course, we have very different rules to you guys around private equity. And we've seen a number of minority stakes, total buyouts, movement between funds, and we've acted on a number of them. So I think at the moment that's been in the kind of where is there value to be driven out of those platforms that then creates a return for PE. And typically in the UK, that's been more in the kind of areas where there's challenges around lockup. So whether that's clinical negligence, serious injury, conveyancing, where they're historically quite, and this is not to be pejorative about the law firms that do this, right? But the kind of strength that PE brings is how do you get value out of transformation, right? And or cost cutting. And actually, in those firms, we know that PE's made a huge difference to the profitability of those organizations, and they will grow really quickly. So I guess that's been pretty interesting. I think in the UK, we're seeing some really interesting stuff in B2C, and not just kind of really strong verticals. So just thinking about like conveyancing, we've got Blixt who own Simply Conveyancing, who've just like such an interesting model, doing really interesting things in that space, all about digital acquisition of clients, customers. Just, I think that's fascinating. And I think how can a law firm that has a business that does that keep up with the strength and depth of that type of organization? I think it's hard to see. So I suspect in the UK, we're going to end up with some really deep, high quality verticals that I go to for my conveyancing, as opposed to lots of law firms having components.
Do you think that some of the law firms will adopt more of a hybrid mentality where they will have some of those structures, hand in hand with obviously the traditional 8 years to partnership, then equity, long road, long escalator, very stable partnerships? What do you think?
Um, that is a really hard question, so thanks. I think there are some firms that have that without having a differing model at the moment, and they're very stretched. So if you've got a kind of core firm that's doing deals or finance work, and then you've also got a huge working capital cycle clinical negligence practice, that's hard to make it fit together in a way where everyone feels like part and parcel of the same thing. And firms have started to put those outside of groups, brand them on their own or whatever. Could you have part P ownership of that? Don't know. I think it's hard. I think it's quite hard within there's often like leveraged funding to support the working capital issue. The working capital cycle of those sorts of businesses is offset against the strength of the LLP. So it's not easy to just break them apart or create completely different ownership structures. I'm sure there's a way around that. There's a lot of smarter people than me.
It's interesting that, a firm like Mishcon de Reya is kind of creating a solar system of other businesses that add value to the central enterprise that are structured differently. A&O had that. It's going to be retreating as a result of the merger, obviously, but they had a standalone consulting opportunity, flexible attorney scheme. So again, people seem to be playing around with these different things, but no one has really been able to kind of, build it out at scale, I think is the issue.
I think that's true.
So just to take a moment and step back, Greg, you had described, and Howard asked the question, ABS. So alternative business structure is the definition of that. And that is the name for the entity that is allowed in the UK to take private investment of capital in law firm structures, as well as allowing law firms to be publicly traded. Is that correct? Okay.
And then there are also some other models whereby you're in effect a service provider, of which there are some great businesses that are somewhat global in their nature. So in the UK, we've got Elevate, Lawyers on Demand, like there's Axiom, I think they're called now, Factor Axiom. So there's a load of really interesting platforms that operate that are not pure law firms, but more like managed legal services. And look, we, PwC, provide that ourselves in the UK as an adjunct. Let's get a little bit of sales chat in there. So I personally think that disaggregation and use of that makes sense. If we know realized rates have gone up by 40%, right, and you're kind of on the legal ops side in a client, you're thinking, how do I structure jobs to go to the right place for the right price point for the right quality level?
And I'm hearing about PE firms, either minority stakes, like you said, or frankly, buying out entire firms, doing earnouts or some kind of anchoring of keeping the partners in place unto performance, but rolling up firms. There's a IP group that I've heard that's been doing this, and was talking to a French firm that I knew one of their attorneys in. They're partners with the whole team in Asia. And like, there's different dynamics I know where this is continuing to happen. It sounds like a storm that's taking place. There's quite a bit of this taking place. It's not happening in the United States at that level at all. It's very quiet here. There's a little bit that's happening. Is this disruptive for your clients? Is this exciting for your clients? Does this keep them up at night, lose sleep? Are they trying to figure out how to compete with this extra capital in the UK game?
I think we're still quite early.
Okay.
A number of the kind of investments that have been made at a total firm level, like DWF, or a component part, stakes within, I still think like it's probably quite early days to see how those firms, how they're progressing and what they're doing. But if you are, there's two things, right? First of all, there's, can I get a carve out capital receipt for investment for a business that I currently have, which is not dissimilar to the kind of adjunct businesses that Howard described, where it actually is a kind of legal component. And we talked about some of them, serious injury, whatever. Obviously, firms will be thinking, okay, maybe there's new money that might be interested in those businesses. Whereas previously, either you would have kept them running and be thinking about how do I invest in this so the working capital issue doesn't grow further, but I keep this really high quality business going because they make really good money, versus a kind of, well, can I package it up and put it out into the market and someone would want to roll that up? To your point, I think the kind of the adjacency in the UK in particular has been a huge amount of roll up in accounting here, where our corporate finance practice has been really busy. A lady called Amy Edwards kind of doing a whole load of work in that space. So it's possible, right? But I think I do think it's hard in that there's a decision made about who has long-term value and who gets that long-term value, which I think is part of why fewer firms have gone down that route. And we've obviously had listed firms that have had challenges as well. But I think one of the questions that the funds have got to get to over time is where do these things go next?
Yeah.
So if you are very successful with them and they grow, the next, when you're thinking about, to your point, you've generated value and you want to have an exit, what's the next? Because it's quite hard to get your head around buying a law firm or buying a component of a law firm. Are the next stage of funds up in terms of size got their heads around that yet? I don't know. I'm sure they will do. So it's an escalation of scaling. I think there's probably then a question about where do you go for growth if you make the entity more efficient and capture more clients and scale? Where does growth go from there? Which, is it go horizontal into other similar B2C areas? I don't know. So definitely think it's super interesting, disruptive area that we're doing a lot of work in is really interesting. So.
Yeah, I don't know how you do that when the main assets are people, right? And then people age, and then people have changes in their lifestyles and at different.
I mean, I don't age, Howard. I'm still about 12, so it's all right.
I'm right behind you, Greg.
So it's definitely been demonstrated in other industries, whether it's engineering, other professional service firms that are publicly traded, and there's going to be enough academic application to this and people who step out and want to make this happen. Consulting, I know E&Y, it was the failed spinoff of their consulting group, and that was the kind of the intent of that. Law firms, unique in and of itself, they're going to figure it out. I'm curious because years ago when I got into this industry, ALM put out an article, what if the law firm went public? What if it was publicly traded? How were the partners cashed out? What was the trading activity, the visibility in the U.S., public markets? And I think personally, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Greg, but I think it's more of a matter of when, not if, we're going to eventually get to those kinds of conversations. You dangle in front of Kirkland the opportunity to make a multiple on top of what they're doing right now with a top line revenue of 7 billion, 8 billion in revenue, and those guys walk away with massive paychecks. I'll bet they'll figure it out.
Okay, I'll take a counterpoint to that, only for the sake of taking a counterpoint to it, which is, I think the thing that I always say to people I work with that is why I really enjoy working with law firms is there's such an amazing story to be able to talk about bringing people through. Someone I've worked with for a very long time, and actually they've worked with me on all these jobs. Now I'm going to bring them through into the partnership, and they will earn fantastic money, be another string in the bow for that organization. There is huge personal value in that for the individuals who bring people through and then who are brought through. And that's not to say that system can't be broken, obviously, but I do think there's an inherent power to that. And I don't mean a power in a negative way or control over someone. I mean it in that's really attractive. That makes people want to stay in those type of organizations. And also to Howard's point, how you get people to stick on a platform if they've had a big kind of payout exit. You often see that in forget law firms, right? In all other industries, you bolt something in that was founder-led, amazing product, and quickly the founder's not there anymore. And the product is, to a degree, right? But does it improve or get better because that brain power's left the organization? It's part of a bigger thing. I don't know, sometimes, sure.
And Greg, I think what you're talking about is like it's the power and the attraction of the guild mentality, inside law firms. That's still very, very prevalent because of that culture aspect of taking someone through. When they come in as a trainee, they're sitting in the corner, they're sharing a desk with the partner's office, and they kind of grow as the partners grow. That's a very appealing way to kind of grow your career if you're practicing a craft. That's really interesting.
And also there's a deeply personal commitment. Like, even if I think about the work that I do here and the people I work with who work on projects with me, there's a deeply personal commitment because we work really hard, right? So where I'd say, hey, I'll take a load of money, and I'm not suggesting this is the case, right? But actually someone who then comes through behind me will find that really difficult, and actually maybe they don't make it as a result of that. That's quite an important component of any, and you have a vote, right? Big votes of lots of people who will have quite differing views about that, I think.
No, I share your optimism. I think it's almost like a startup where you're kind of in the trenches together and you're building something, and people obviously get to a point in their career, then they kind of split. But I think that culture really does exist inside some of these storied law firms.
So looking forward, Greg, I mean, you just gave us a quick synopsis of 20 years of consolidation when you were talking about what's been taking place, and you throw private capital and law firms going public and these creative things taking place. If we're going to look at what does the UK legal market look like in 10 years or 20 years from now? Are we expecting the same? I mean, obviously, we're kind of hypothesizing a little bit right now, but yeah, curious.
This is your crystal ball moment there, Greg.
Yeah, we can refer back to this. If I think about the international top tier, which really, I know they don't call themselves Magic Circle, but like that grouping of firms, there is coming a world in which a new global elite of firms is emerging. And at the moment, it's quite a small list of firms, right? And even some of the firms that you would immediately go, well, from a revenue perspective, they're that, right? But even if you took Kirkland, they're still 80+% revenue US, right? That's not to say they're clearly in that group, but on the kind of definitions you might have, I think a new group of firms will emerge. And I think those will be the firms that can operate UK, US, and there's a thoughtful percentage mix between the two. And it's going to be interesting to see whether there are more deals done. But I certainly think the balance of those firms has to become more US, because you want USD, it's important from a currency perspective, US clients, US outbound work into Europe is so important. US will be the number one investor in every single geography, pretty much. So I can see a world in which that sort of group becomes, alongside a group of US headquartered firms, a kind of new, different kind of group. I think when you look at the kind of really high quality international firms that sit them outside of that, I think they're all everyone's thinking about US deals, right? And that group in particular will be thinking about that really hard. And many of them have been spoken about in the media. I'm not going to name them because I don't want to offside myself in any way, right? But lots of them have been thinking about that for a long time. I think pragmatism is going to be essential in that, which is what deals are possible as opposed to inward consideration of lists of firms and wouldn't it be great if. It's got to be, can we get something done? That is really hard because there's a perception about brand and quality, etc. You've then got the very large Varine firms. And I think the question will be, how can they take friction out of the system and get value from having already done that? Whether the model's right or wrong is sort of an irrelevance, but how do you get value from US, UK model where you have differing structures is going to be essential, right, for those firms. I think integration in those is just so hard. It's just complicated. So there's an element of how can you be more effective around go-to-market, around, cross-selling, around all of those things. Then I think below, say, the top 12, there are some really specific firms who are doing really well in the US, like Clyde is doing really well in the US. And I think they're just a really interesting firm, got a great management team, can see them doing a lot more there. I'm not, whether it's inorganic or organic, I just think I think people perceive that. And you two nodded at the moment I said that. So if I'm saying that and you're saying that, it must be vaguely true. I then think there's a whole group of firms, Adelshaw Goddard, Bird & Bird, Pinsent Masons, who are all fantastic platforms who've got, publicly stated ambitions to grow. And I could see them all, driving into the $1 billion, €1 billion, £1 billion space because they've all said that that's where they want to be. So I think it will look a bit different. I'm always of a view of if you were to posit some things out there of UK deals, I definitely think there will be some of some scale because I just think there's sense in it. Build from strength, creates depth, culture is aligned, client bases can get aligned. Then there's, how do you go to the US from a bit more scale and position of relative strength? So I think it's going to be so interesting. And that sort of recency bias of, well, have there been that many deals and therefore do we need to do them? I think when firms are performing really well, it's not a case of why not. It's more a case of, well, I could see if things tip over into a period of less strength, people will start to look around and think, well, where's the growth going to come from? And actually synergies, integration and kind of combinations people bring that more into their mindset. Do we need to do deals now? Is there a burning platform? Quite hard to convince people, I think, when you're doing 10% plus income, top line and profit growth.
Great. How can people find you, contact you, follow you on social media? Well,
we just launched our law firm survey, and the internal PwC team have been bemoaning the fact that I seem to be everywhere on LinkedIn at the moment. So you can find me in some videos, you can find me posting things on LinkedIn all the time. So 100%, if you're you're a US firm interested in the UK, look me up. And obviously all my UK clients, hello.
So Greg, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you both very much.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it.